Think for a moment about how you know the things you're most certain about. Is it always because, well, someone told you, or because you read it somewhere?
Right, like in a book or article.
Or is there maybe another kind of knowing, a way of simply experiencing something directly?
That immediate sense of something being present.
Yeah, maybe it's that moment you look at something really familiar, picture on your wall or maybe a landscape you see every day, and then suddenly you see it in a completely new way.
A hidden pattern pops out, or you notice a significance that just wasn't there for you before.
Exactly. Or think about the difference between reading, say, a super detailed description of a place
Knowing all the facts about it.
and actually being there.
Yeah.
Feeling the atmosphere, taking it all in, not just with your eyes and ears, but like with your whole being.
That's a huge difference, isn't it? Knowing about versus really knowing.
That's precisely the space we're exploring today. There's a difference between knowing about something and truly, maybe deeply, knowing it through direct experience or acquaintance.
And that leads us right into today's topic.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a really fundamental question, one that gets debated a lot.
Yeah.
What exactly do people mean when they talk about knowing God, and specifically when they say this knowing comes by faith?
It's a core concept in so many religious traditions.
Right. And just to be clear up front, we're not trying to answer whether that knowledge is, real or valid in an ultimate sense.
No, that's not the goal here.
Our goal is more about understanding how someone might conceive of it structurally. How does this kind of knowing supposedly work? And we're diving into this using a really fascinating piece of academic analysis that you, our listener, actually provided. So thank you for that.
Yes, thank you. And our mission really is to take the specific argument laid out in this source material and carefully unpack its core ideas. Because this analysis offers a pretty different way of thinking about religious faith.
How so?
It really challenges that very common assumption that faith is mostly about believing a set of statements or propositions about God.
Like believing that God exists or that certain things are true.
Exactly. Instead, it suggests maybe we should look at faith as something much more like perception or direct acquaintance or even a particular way of, experiencing the world around us.
Okay, and you mentioned the scope. It's important, as you said earlier, that the analysis itself makes its limits really clear from the get-go.
Absolutely. It stresses this isn't an argument for the truth of faith.
It's not trying to convince anyone God is real.
Not at all. It aims to be descriptive, or what philosophers sometimes call phenomenological. It's trying to describe what faith is like as a mode of knowing or experiencing.
How it appears to the person experiencing it.
Precisely. And the aim is to describe it in a way that someone who has this kind of experience and someone who doesn't could both look at the description and say, okay, I get the phenomenon you're describing.
I understand the structure you're pointing to, even if I don't share it or believe it corresponds to reality.
Right. That crucial question of whether the experience is veridical, whether it actually matches up with reality, that's explicitly set aside for this particular exploration.
So we're focused on understanding the structure, the form, maybe the grammar of this kind of knowledge claim, rather than trying to judge its truth.
Exactly. And to get at that structure, the analysis suggests we start by thinking about how we know things more generally, and it makes a really crucial distinction right at the beginning.
Okay, let's unpack that. What's the core distinction here?
Well, the analysis lays out two fundamental modes of cognition, basically two ways we know things.
Okay.
The first one is called cognition in presence.
Cognition in presence.
Okay. This is knowing things that are directly here, right now, immediately before us.
Okay.
It's the kind of knowing you typically get through your senses, seeing, hearing, touching something that's physically present in your immediate environment.
Like seeing the cup on the table right now.
Exactly. The source uses the term acquaintance for this, maybe a bit more broadly than some philosophers might, but essentially meaning that direct, immediate awareness of something present.
Got it. So cognition in presence. What's the other mode?
The second mode is cognition in absence.
Okay, absence. Makes sense.
This is knowing things that are not directly present to your senses at that moment. This is where you hold beliefs about something.
Right, so facts, information.
Exactly. You know facts, propositions, theories, maybe based on information you've received or evidence you've gathered, or perhaps based on someone else's authority, someone who was present or who has expertise. But the object of your knowledge isn't something you're currently perceiving or directly experiencing right here, right now.
So like knowing about historical events. Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon, for example. I wasn't there.
Perfect example. Or knowing scientific theories about things like quarks or distant galaxies, things you can't directly see. Or even just knowing what your friend who lives far away is doing right now because they sent you a text. That's all cognition in absence.
Okay, so perception. Direct acquaintance. That's cognition in presence. Believing statements, facts, theories about things not present. That's cognition in absence, or maybe just beliefs about. Seems pretty clear.
It does seem straightforward on the surface, presence versus absence. But this is where the analysis points to something it calls an astonishing fact. When you look closely at religious understanding, particularly within the Christian tradition it focuses on.
Astonishing. How so?
It asks us to look at the actual literature of religious life, not necessarily systematic theology at first, but things like the Bible itself, devotional writings, prayers, hymns, sermons. What kind of knowing do these texts predominantly describe or assume?
Okay, what do they assume?
The analysis argues they are just filled with accounts that presuppose a cognition of God by acquaintance, a cognition in presence.
Really? So more like that direct here and now knowing.
Yes. People in these texts speak constantly of direct encounters with God, of having personal dealings with what they perceive as a divine thou, a present reality, not just an abstract concept.
I'm going to give an example.
Well, think of the Psalms in the Old Testament. The writers often speak of seeing God's power or feeling his presence or God being their refuge right now. Or in the New Testament, the Gospels describe the disciples walking with Jesus. Their experience isn't portrayed merely as learning facts about God, but experiencing Jesus' actions, his words, his very being as somehow mediating God's presence and purpose to them directly. It seems to be saturated with this language of immediate awareness and relationship.
Okay, I see that contrast. Lots of encounter language. But then how does this contrast with, say, formal theology?
That's the core tension the analysis highlights. It contrasts this lived, expressed experience found in much religious literature with the way faith has often been defined in theological literature, especially in the dominant systems that shaped Western Christianity.
So the academic definitions didn't quite match the lived description.
That's the argument. The analysis claims that theological systems, for the most part, have really only recognized or emphasized cognition in absence when defining what faith is. If you look at the Catholic tradition, heavily influenced by someone like St. Thomas Aquinas, or the Protestant orthodoxy that developed after the Reformation.
The big systematic thinkers.
Right. The analysis argues that both traditions explicitly defined faith primarily in terms of believing certain propositional truths on God's authority.
So faith equals believing that certain things are true because God revealed them.
Precisely. Faith becomes assent to revealed statements. That God exists, that he is triune, that certain historical events happen in a specific way, and so on. The believing is based on the authority of the revealer, God, but the mode of knowing is primarily accepting propositions.
So this shifts the emphasis. Instead of faith being seen, maybe primarily as a kind of religious response to God's perceived action or presence in the world, like the disciples responding to Jesus, it gets defined predominantly as, well, an assent to theological truths.
Yes, an intellectual or perhaps volitional agreement to propositions about God, rather than necessarily a direct relational encounter with God.
And the source material views this shift pretty critically, right?
Very critically. It describes this assimilation of faith to primarily propositional belief as a very major and radical step taken early on in Christian history, and strongly suggests it was potentially a wrong step.
A wrong step. That's strong language.
It is. The analysis notes that figures like the 16th century reformers Luther, Calvin actually tried to push back against this purely intellectual view and recover a more relational, encounter-based understanding of faith, emphasizing trust and personal relationship.
But the formal definitions didn't entirely follow.
According to this analysis, while the reformers stressed the relational aspect, subsequent Protestant orthodoxy often still fell back on defining faith primarily in terms of assent to correct doctrine. So this theological move, defining faith mainly as cognition and absence, had really profound and lasting implications for how faith was understood and taught.
Okay, so if that traditional theological definition feels maybe incomplete or like it doesn't capture the full picture described in religious experience itself, what's the alternative proposed here?
The analysis suggests we need to find a viable way, or perhaps even ways, of thinking about faith as a form of cognition by acquaintance, or cognition in presence.
So bring it closer to that direct experience model.
Exactly. How might we explore the idea that faith could be assimilated to perception? Again, not saying it is sense perception, but that its underlying structure, its way of knowing, is more like perception than it is like holding beliefs about something absent, whether those beliefs come from reason or sheer will.
That's a really significant reorientation. It feels like it immediately bumps up against a major objection, though.
It absolutely does. And the analysis anticipates this inevitable protest, as it calls it.
Yeah, I mean, the immediate thought is, how on earth can knowing God be like perceiving something? God, by definition, in most of these traditions, isn't a physical object. You can't see or hear God in the same way you see a tree or hear a bird sing.
Right. God is usually defined as transcendent, invisible, immaterial.
And traditional theology, as we just discussed, often frame faith precisely as believing without seeing, believing despite not having direct perception. So surely faith must be a case of cognition in absence, a matter of belief about, not perception-like acquaintance.
It's a very strong intuitive objection. And this is where the analysis has to be extremely careful in clarifying its hypothesis. It's really vital to grasp this point. The claim is not that religious faith is sense perception.
Okay, that's important. It's not equating the two.
No, that would be, frankly, absurd given the nature of God in these traditions. The claim, rather, is that faith, understood as a form of cognition by acquaintance, that direct here and now kind of awareness is more like sense perception in its fundamental epistemological structure than it is like holding propositional beliefs about an absent object.
So the comparison is about the mode or the structure of the knowing, not about the object being known or the sensory organs involved.
Precisely. It's an analogy of form, not content. And the analysis quickly adds that this view doesn't dismiss the importance of propositions. Statements about God or reality that are founded upon this primary awareness are seen as indispensable and immensely valuable.
We need language to articulate and share the experience.
Of course. Propositions are crucial for theology, for community, for reflection. But the core focus of this particular analysis is on trying to understand the nature of that foundational awareness itself, the awareness of God itself, as they put it, which is claimed to underlie those propositions.
Okay, so to make this analogy between religious awareness and perception work, even just structurally, we probably need a more nuanced understanding of perception itself.
Exactly. We can't just assume perception is a simple passive recording of the external world. And the analysis brings in a concept here that's become pretty widely accepted in philosophy, thanks in large part to Ludwig Wittgenstein.
Wittgenstein, okay.
Yeah.
What's the concept?
It's the idea of seeing as, which Wittgenstein discussed quite famously in his philosophical investigations. The basic point is that seeing, and perception generally, isn't just a matter of photons hitting your retina and producing an image in your brain. There's an active, interpretive element involved right from the start.
Our minds are actively making sense of the input, not just recording it.
That's the idea. And the easiest way to grasp this seeing as phenomenon is through those classic ambiguous figures used in psychology.
Oh, right, like the Necker cube.
Exactly, the Necker cube. That simple line drawing of a cube. You look at it and your perception flips, doesn't it? One moment you see it as if you're looking down from above onto the top face.
And the next moment you're seeing it as if you're looking up from below at the bottom face. The lines on the page haven't changed at all.
But how you see them, the spatial structure you perceive, alternates. Your mind interprets the same data in two different ways.
Or a duck rabbit. That's another famous one.
Jastra's duck rabbit, yes. The same drawing can be instantly seen as a rabbit's head looking left or a duck's head looking right.
And Kuhler's goblet faces, too.
Yeah.
The outline is either a goblet or vase in the middle, or it's two faces in profile looking at each other.
Right. In all these cases, which the analysis calls examples of total ambiguity, the objective physical stimulus hitting your retina is constant. The lines are the same. But your conscious perception shifts between two distinct interpretations, each assigning a different character, a different nature, a different meaning or significance to that same stimulus.
And you can often consciously make it switch back and forth.
You can. There's also another category mentioned, emergent pattern cases.
Like those pictures made of dots.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Like those puzzle pictures where at first you just see a jumble of meaningless dots or splotches. But then suddenly you perceive a figure emerging from the noise. Maybe it's a face or an animal. The famous example given is a picture known as Christ in the Snow,
Where the pattern suddenly clicks into place.
Right. The physical marks haven't changed, but your perception of them has been radically transformed. You now see a meaningful pattern where before there was just randomness. You're seeing the dots and lines as a face.
Okay, so seeing as is this basic phenomena where the same sensory input can be consciously perceived in different ways, giving it different characters or meanings.
Exactly. And the analysis then broadens this idea from just vision, seeing as, to encompass all our senses, calling it experiencing as.
So it applies to hearing, touch, taste, smell, too.
Yes. Think about hearing a sound in the woods. You might hear it as a bird song, or you might hear the same sound pattern as just the rustling of leaves in the wind. Or imagine a skilled carpenter running their hand over a piece of wood. They might feel it as mahogany, identifying it through touch based on texture, density, grain.
Or tasting wine as a specific type, like a Burgundy, or smelling cheese as Gorgonzola. It's about recognition through the senses.
Exactly. These are all instances where the raw sensory data, the sound waves, the tactile sensations, the chemical signals are interpreted and identified as something specific, something with a particular character and meaning based on our prior experience and concepts.
And normally our senses work together, right? It's not just one sense in isolation.
Usually, yes. In everyday perception, sight, sound, touch, they all cooperate. So experiencing as, in this broader sense used by the analysis, refers to the integrated end product of all this sensory input as it appears in our consciousness, the meaningful perception that arises when the raw data gets interpreted through our conceptual framework.
It's that moment where the noise becomes signal, where the raw data clicks and becomes something meaningful, something recognized.
That's a good way to put it. And now the analysis wants to take this concept of experiencing as, illustrated by these examples, and apply it to our perception of the real world, and then, by analogy, to religious awareness.
Okay, so moving beyond the lab examples, how does experiencing as show up in just, well, regular life?
Think about those little moments of misperception, or maybe just ambiguous perception. You glance into a field and see a tuft of grass, but for a split second, you experience it as a rabbit. Your mind interprets the shape and color as rabbit, even if you immediately correct yourself.
Or you're in a dark room, and the shadows on the wall suddenly coalesce, and you experience them as someone standing there. Give you a
Exactly. Those are common everyday instances of experiencing as, where objective reality, the grass, the shadows, is momentarily interpreted and experienced as something else meaningful. A rabbit, a person.
So the interpretation happens instantly, before conscious correction sometimes.
Often, yes. And this leads us to the core analogy the analysis wants to explore. It draws a parallel between these simple, often fleeting perceptual cases of experiencing as, and two fundamentally contrasting ways of experiencing the much broader canvas of our lives and human history.
Okay, what are the two ways?
On the one hand, the analysis suggests one can experience all the events of life and history purely as natural occurrences.
Explainable by science, psychology, economics, chance.
Right. Explainable entirely within a framework of natural laws, cause and effect, human actions, motivations, social forces, and maybe random chance. That's one way of experiencing as the world.
And the other way?
The other way is to experience these very same events, the same joys, sorrows, historical shifts, personal encounters, as somehow mediating the presence and activity of God.
So the religious person experiences the same world, but experiences it as something more, or something different in quality.
That's precisely the argument. This is what the analysis proposes happens in religious faith. It leads to this provocative idea that, in one sense, the religious person and the atheist or non-believer both live in the same world.
They inhabit the same physical space, face the same events.
Yes, the same physical environment, the same historical changes confront them both. But the analysis argues in another, perhaps more profound sense related to conscious experience, they live in different worlds.
How so? Different worlds.
The difference lies in the actual concrete character of their moment-to-moment experience, the nature of their streams of consciousness. For the religious person, according to this view, life takes on a different nature and quality, a different meaning and significance, because they experience it, at least sometimes, as a continual interaction with the transcendent God.
So that layer of perceived divine interaction fundamentally alters how everything else feels and means.
It imbues their experience with a quality, a significance that is simply absent from the direct experience of the person without that particular faith framework. For the atheist, that dimension of reality, that way of experiencing as, isn't part of their conscious world.
Okay, but this brings us right back, maybe even more forcefully, to that problem of subjectivity we touched on earlier.
Yes, it does.
If religious experience is being compared to seeing a puzzle picture in a certain way, or seeing grass as a rabbit, Doesn't that make it sound incredibly subjective? Doesn't it seem to underline, once again, as the analysis puts it, the purely subjective and gratuitous character of religious knowledge claims?
Especially when you contrast it with what we usually think of as the solid, compelling objectivity of ordinary sense perception.
Right. It seems like this analogy puts religious experience on the same level as an illusion or a personal projection or maybe even a mistake, compared to just seeing the facts of the world.
It certainly seems that way at first glance, and the analysis acknowledges this potential conclusion quite directly, saying, so far as the argument has thus far gone, perhaps it does underline the subjective character.
Okay, so it admits that's where the argument seems to be heading.
But then it immediately signals that this is precisely the point where the argument takes a crucial, decisive turn, a turn that must considerably affect the upshot of what has gone before.
Ah, okay, so there's a counter move coming. What is it?
This is where the analysis makes its boldest claim, the thesis that really reframes the entire discussion. And it sounds, as you might expect, quite paradoxical initially.
What's the claim?
The claim is that all experiencing is experiencing as...
Wait, all experiencing, not just the ambiguous cases or the mistaken ones?
No, all conscious experiencing. Even seeing that tuft of grass correctly as a tuft of grass. Or seeing the fork on the table correctly as a fork. That, too, is fundamentally an instance of experiencing as.
That does sound paradoxical. Why would you say you're seeing the fork as a fork? It just is a fork. You're just seeing what's there.
It feels redundant, right? The analysis grants that using the specific phrase, seeing it as a fork, sounds distinctly odd in most circumstances, precisely because it's so obvious and automatic for us.
So why make the claim?
Because, the argument goes, we have other, more common and acceptable names for this ordinary, everyday seeing as, in real life. We call it recognizing or identifying.
Ah, okay. So when I see the fork, I am, in fact, recognizing it as a fork.
That's the claim. We don't usually notice the act of recognition with familiar objects because it's so fast, so effortless, so deeply ingrained. But it is an act of recognition, an act of interpretation, however unconscious.
Okay. I can sort of see that, but what's the significance of calling recognition experiencing as?
The crucial point is this. Recognizing something as a this or a that, which the analysis equates with this fundamental form of experiencing, as is always done in terms of a concept.
In terms of a concept?
Yes. You recognize the object as an instance of the concept fork. And the analysis stresses that our concepts aren't somehow inherent in the physical objects themselves. They are social products having their life within a particular linguistic environment.
So forkness isn't physically part of the metal.
Exactly. Think about the example used in the analysis. An exotic fork, maybe one from a different culture or era that looks unusual. You might have to consciously think about it, examine it, and then you might say, ah, I can recognize this thing as a fork. You're identifying its function, its purpose within a cultural practice, eating, and applying the concept fork to it. The meaning isn't stamped on the object, it's brought to the object through the concept.
Okay, and the Stone Age person example helps here too.
Immensely. Imagine someone from a Stone Age culture who has never encountered cutlery suddenly sees a fork. They would not be able to recognize it as a fork simply because they lack the concept fork within their conceptual framework, within their understanding of the world.
They might see it as something else, though.
Oh, certainly. They would experience it as something using the concepts they do possess. Maybe they'd see it as a shiny object, or as a sharp thing, potentially useful as a weapon, or as a tool for digging, or perhaps as an object imbued with some kind of special power or mana. They interpret it through their available conceptual lens.
And the analysis makes that sharp point, saying the Stone Age person lacks the concept fork and saying they cannot recognize the object as a fork are basically two ways of saying the same thing.
Yes, the ability to recognize, to experience as in a specific way is completely bound up with possessing and applying the relevant concept.
And this applies to natural objects too, not just human-made artifacts.
Absolutely. The analysis argues that recognizing something flying in the sky as a bird isn't just about registering its shape, color, and movement in that instant. It involves applying the concept bird.
And that concept carries a lot of baggage with it.
It carries a huge amount of implicit understanding that goes much more than is currently perceptible. When you recognize that moving shape as a bird, you're implicitly making claims or assumptions about its past. It hatched from an egg. It wasn't assembled in a factory. Its future, it will eventually die. Its internal biological nature and its potential behavior. It will likely fly away if you shout. You're seeing the immediate sensory data as an instance of the rich concept bird.
So even the simplest act of recognition involves interpretation, going beyond the raw data using our conceptual framework.
That's the core argument. All conscious experiencing, even the most mundane, involves these acts of recognition or identification experiencing as that go beyond the strictly given sensory data by interpreting that data in terms of concepts.
Okay, that's a big claim. All experiencing is experiencing as. How does that help address the subjectivity problem with a religious analogy?
It's the crucial turning point because if all experiencing is fundamentally a form of experiencing as, then ordinary, everyday, secular perception is not some kind of simple, automatic, purely objective registration of brute facts about the world.
It also involves interpretation.
Yes, it means that ordinary perception shares a common epistemological character with religious experiencing. Both involve this interpretive step.
So we have to ditch that simplistic picture, the one where, regular seeing is just objective fact gathering, while religious seeing is just subjective meaning making layered on top.
Exactly. We have to abandon that dichotomy. The analysis argues that both processes, secular perceiving and religious perceiving, involve moving beyond the raw sensory report to perceive a significance, a character, an identity that wasn't present as such in the initial sensory input alone. Both involve making sense of the data through concepts.
That brings in the quote from John Oman, doesn't it?
Yes, the analysis quotes Oman saying something like, "Knowing is not knowledge as an effect of an unknown external cause, but is knowledge as we so interpret that our meaning is the actual meaning of our environment."
Knowing involves interpretation to grasp meaning.
Right, and the analysis suggests this applies across the board. Knowing the world, whether in a secular or a religious way, involves this interpretive act of finding meaning. And the religious believers' claim within this framework is that in their faith, they are interpreting and relating to their total environment in its most ultimate meaning.
Okay. So by arguing that ordinary perception is also fundamentally interpretive, a form of experiencing as, the analysis seems to level the playing field, epistemologically speaking.
That's the goal. It aims to show that religious perception isn't necessarily more subjective or gratuitous in its basic structure than our everyday perception of forks, birds, or anything else. Both involve this active process of making sense of the world through concepts. It provides a framework to meet that subjectivity objection head-on.
This new perspective that all experiencing is experiencing as, it must change how we look at that other big objection too, the one about needing prior acquaintance.
It does. Let's revisit that. The objection was, you need to have seen rabbits before you can see a tuft of grass as a rabbit. So to experience events as acts of God, don't you need some prior direct acquaintance with undeniable, unambiguous acts of God?
And the problem was, we don't seem to get unambiguous divine acts. We just get ambiguous events. Coincidences, recoveries, historical turns that could be seen as divine acts by faith, but could also be explained naturally by a skeptic.
Right. The world doesn't seem to present us with events labeled act of God certified unambiguous. We only seem to get events that can take on religious significance to the eyes of faith, but which remain open to purely natural interpretations.
So the argument felt really strong. Since we lack those clear, unproblematic examples of divine action, unlike our clear examples of rabbits or forks, how could we ever possibly acquire the capacity to recognize any of these ambiguous events as acts of God? It seems like a catch-22. If you've never seen a definite divine act, you can't learn to recognize one.
It felt like a conclusive objection, as the analysis itself admitted on the face of it. But the analysis argues this seemingly conclusive objection effectively collapses if we accept the previous thesis that all experiencing involves recognition and is a form of experiencing as.
How does it collapse?
The key insight hinges on our capacity to learn. While the exact neurological or cognitive process of recognition might still hold mysteries, the undeniable fact is that we do continually recognize things. And even more crucially, we can learn to recognize.
We weren't born knowing what a fork is.
Exactly. We learn to identify rabbits, forks, trees, birds, human emotions, complex social situations, musical styles, and countless other things, essentially starting from scratch as infants and children learning the concepts and associations of our culture and language.
So if we can learn to recognize all those things,
Then the analysis concludes, In principle, there is thus far no difficulty with the claim that human beings might also be able to learn to use the concept act of God, just as we learn other, perhaps equally complex, concepts.
And once we've learned the concept.
We could then acquire the capacity to recognize what we take to be exemplifying instances of it, moments or events that we experience as divine actions, even within the inherently ambiguous flow of life and history. The ambiguity doesn't prevent recognition, because all recognition involves interpreting potentially ambiguous data through a learned conceptual lens.
Okay, that addresses the structural problem of how learning could even start. But the analysis acknowledges there are still huge differences between recognizing a fork and recognizing an act of God, right?
Oh, absolutely. It immediately concedes that there are obvious and indeed immense differences. It's not trying to smooth over those.
What are the main differences highlighted?
Well, first, the conceptual category is different. Act of God is primarily an event concept, a happening, whereas rabbit or fork are typically concepts of objects or substances. That alone is a considerable conceptual contrast.
Right, events versus things.
And perhaps more importantly, the analysis points out that the biblical understanding of knowing God isn't usually portrayed as just spotting isolated divine interventions, like finding specific objects. It's described as something much wider, more continuous.
Like what?
Like an awareness of existing in the presence of God, a more pervasive sense of living within God's reality, his ambience.
So not just seeing God do something specific, but sensing God's presence more generally.
Yes. Within that framework, those striking events, often called miracles or theophanies, direct appearances of God, are seen more as points of peculiarly intense focus within this broader, ongoing awareness of God's presence. They are moments when that background awareness becomes foreground, becomes sharp and vivid, often triggered by unusual events, but not limited to them.
So the main focus for the analysis isn't just recognizing specific acts, but this wider sense of the presence of God.
That seems to be the primary concern. Understanding this wider and more continuous awareness, this sense of living within the ambience of the unseen God. And the analysis readily admits this is surely something very unlike the awareness of forks and rabbits.
The content of the experience is vastly different.
Vastly different, and this is the core point of this section, even with that huge difference in subject matter, God's presence versus physical objects, the analysis insists that the underlying epistemological structure exhibits a continuity.
Because both involve this fundamental process of experiencing it.
Exactly. Because religious awareness, like awareness of forks and rabbits, is proposed to be a form of experiencing as interpreting reality through learned concepts. It shares a fundamental structural character with our awareness in other fields. And this shared structure, the analysis argues, is what provides the connecting links that prevent religious awareness from being dismissed as completely unintelligible, even to someone who doesn't share the faith. It shows a potential continuity with other ways we know the world.
Okay. So to explore that continuity further, the analysis delves deeper into the nature of experiencing as itself.
Yes, it looks at another feature. The idea that experiencing as often occurs at various levels of awareness. It's not always just a single interpretation.
Levels. How does that work?
The analysis makes a helpful distinction between two kinds of levels. First, there are mutually exclusive levels.
Like the duck and the rabbit?
Exactly. Experiencing the drawing as a duck is incompatible with experiencing it as a rabbit at the exact same instant and in the same respect. You flip between them, they exclude each other. Or seeing someone's face as furiously angry versus profoundly delighted, usually, you see one or the other.
Okay, mutually exclusive. What's the other kind?
The other kind is supplementary levels. This is where experiencing something as Y presupposes but also goes beyond experiencing it as X. The higher level interpretation, Y, builds upon and adds a richer layer of meaning or specificity to the lower level interpretation, X.
Can you give an example of these supplementary levels?
The analysis uses a great example from bird watching. Imagine you see something moving in the sky.
Okay.
At the most basic level, you might experience it as a bird. That's a fundamental recognition, level 1.
Got it.
Now, if you know a bit more, you might look closer and recognize it as a hawk. That's a higher level of recognition, level 2. It presupposes bird. All hawks are birds. But it's more specific.
Right. More detail.
Then, an even more experienced birdwatcher might observe its flight pattern and behavior and experience it as a hawk engaged in searching for prey. That's level 3, presupposing hawk and bird, but adding an interpretation of its current activity and intention.
Okay, seeing its behavior as hunting.
And perhaps a real expert, knowing the terrain and the hawk's habits, might see it circle in a particular way and experience it as a hawk about to swoop on something hidden from your view behind a hill. That's level 4, a highly specific interpretation based on subtle cues, building on all the previous levels. These are successively higher level recognitions, each adding significance.
That makes sense. Levels of increasing specificity and interpretation. And this ties into the idea of significance itself.
Yes. The analysis defines significance as the direct correlate of experiencing as. What does it mean for something to be significant as X? The analysis links significance to the notion of appropriate response.
Appropriate response.
Yes. To recognize something as X, as a fork, as a hawk, as a threat, as an opportunity, means that you are thereby put into a particular dispositional state.
A dispositional state, like a readiness.
Exactly. A readiness, a tendency, a preparedness to act towards it, interact with it, or think about it in a specific way or range of ways that are considered appropriate for things of type X.
So recognizing the object on the table as a fork puts me in a dispositional state to potentially pick it up and eat with it, but not to try and write with it.
Perfect. Whereas recognizing it as a fountain pen puts you in a dispositional state to potentially write with it, but not, one hopes, to eat spaghetti with it. The recognition triggers a different set of expectations, potential uses, and readiness to respond. Recognizing something as significant in a certain way just is being in that corresponding dispositional state, that particular readiness to engage appropriately.
Okay. Now, how does this apply beyond single objects? The analysis moves to situations, right?
Right. The focus shifts from isolated objects as the basic units of significance to larger, more complex units, situations. A situation isn't just a random jumble of objects. It's a configuration of objects, events, agents, and circumstances that, when attended to as a whole, possesses its own distinctive meaning or significance.
A significance that's more than just the sum of its parts.
Often, yes. And crucially, a situation perceived as a whole evokes its own overall appropriate dispositional response.
And can situations also have these levels of significance, like the birdwatching example?
Absolutely. The analysis argues that situational significance also occurs at different levels, with higher levels typically presupposing and building upon lower ones. And this is where it introduces a really powerful example connecting physical significance to ethical significance.
Ah, the ethical level. How does that work?
Let's picture the scenario described in the analysis. Someone is trapped at the foot of a steep cliff. The tide is coming in rapidly, cutting off their escape. They are shouting desperately for help.
Okay, a very dangerous situation.
Now first, consider this purely at the natural or physical level. What's objectively there? There's a cliff face, a body of water, a human body making sounds, the physical process of water levels rising. The analysis argues that if you strip away any other layer of interpretation, morality apart, that is all that there is. A specific configuration of physical elements and processes, that's level 1 significance. Physical.
Okay, just the bare physical facts.
But the analysis continues. As moral beings, we typically don't just experience the physical facts. We experience those physical events as constituting a situation of moral claim upon ourselves and others present.
We see it as an emergency requiring help.
Exactly. The physical pattern takes on ethical significance. That's level 2. We experience a situation as one where someone's life is in danger and help is required.
And this recognition carries an appropriate response.
Yes. Recognizing the situation as having this ethical significance immediately puts us into a dispositional state where the appropriate response is clear, a readiness and inclination to try and help the trapped person, to do whatever is possible to rescue them.
What about someone who doesn't see it that way? The analysis mentions someone with no moral sense.
Right. It uses this hypothetical figure, someone perhaps pathologically lacking empathy or moral understanding. Such a person, the argument goes, would interpret the situation only at the physical level. They'd see the cliff, the person, the water, but they would fail to be aware of the ethical significance, the moral claim.
They wouldn't experience it as a situation demanding action from them.
Correct. And the analysis makes the point that you probably couldn't prove the moral obligation to such a person using only arguments based on the physical facts. You can't logically deduce ought from is in that way. Threats or promises might induce them to act helpfully, but they wouldn't be acting out of a genuine recognition of the situation's intrinsic moral significance.
So seeing the ethical significance depends on already being a moral being.
The analysis suggests it's almost tautological. We are aware of ethical significance because we are moral beings, perhaps built that way, meaning we possess the conceptual framework. Concepts like duty, value of life, suffering, obligation, that allows us to recognize and respond to ethical dimensions in situations.
So the ethical layer supervenes upon or builds on the physical layer.
Yes, that's the language used. Ethical significance supervenes upon, interpenetrates, and is mediated through the physical significance which it presupposes. You can't have the ethical situation without the underlying physical one. And the dawning awareness of the moral claim is compared again to seeing an emergent pattern in a puzzle picture. The same physical features are there, but you suddenly see them organized into a new, powerful, significant pattern, an inescapable moral demand.
Okay, physical level, ethical level.
Right.
Where does religion come in?
The analysis then introduces religious significance as a yet higher level, potentially. It suggests that experiencing a situation as religiously significant adds a new dimension which both includes and transcends that of moral judgment.
Includes and transcends. So it builds on the moral, but adds something more.
Often, yes, but the relationship is noted as being a bit more complex than the straightforward physical to ethical link. While ethical experience seems to always presuppose physical situations, you need a physical world for moral actions to occur in, religious awareness isn't always simply superimposed directly onto a situation of immediate moral obligation.
So religious awareness can arise in other contexts, too.
Definitely. The analysis describes several contexts where this sense of the presence of God might become particularly vivid. It can happen in solitude, perhaps surrounded by the grandeur of nature, looking at the vastness of the night sky, or the beauty of a landscape can sometimes evoke a powerful sense of divine presence.
A feeling of awe, maybe.
Right. Or it can occur during prayer or meditation, a more contemplative or even mystical awareness that might feel relatively independent of specific external events or circumstances.
More inward-looking.
Yes. And then, very importantly, for the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is the main focus here, there's the prophetic type of religious experience. Here, the awareness of God is often intrinsically linked to specific or general moral demands.
Like the Old Testament prophets.
Exactly. The prophet experiences God's presence as a call for social justice, or as a denunciation of the people's wrongdoing, or as a promise of forgiveness contingent on repentance. The divine presence carries a moral weight or imperative.
So, various contexts.
Yeah.
But does the analysis see a common thread in the response?
Yes, it emphasizes a crucial point. Even when that awareness of God begins in solitude or through nature or in quiet contemplation, it's still normally true that it leads us back to our neighbors and often deepens the ethical significance of our relations with them.
So even mystical experience doesn't just stay inward.
Not usually, according to this view. The appropriate dispositional response, evoked by an awareness of God, regardless of how it first arises, ultimately involves involvement with our neighbors within our common environment. The service of God, even if initiated through nature or mysticism, eventually leads back to engagement and service in the world that we share with others.
Okay, so we have this layered picture. Physical significance, ethical significance building on that, and then religious significance as potentially another layer, including and transcending the others, relating the whole situation to a perceived divine presence or action. And each level of this experiencing as involves recognizing a different kind of significance and prompts a different kind of appropriate response.
That's a good summary of the framework. And now, the analysis takes this framework, faith as religious experiencing, as occurring at various levels, and applies it more specifically to the history of faith documented in the Bible, focusing mainly on that prophetic awareness of God as the typically Judaic Christian form.
Testing the theory against the source text, basically.
Right. How well does this model describe what we actually find in the Bible?
So, looking at the Old Testament prophets first.
Yes. The analysis argues they weren't just political commentators or fortune tellers. They were individuals who were vividly conscious of Yahweh God as acting within the concrete political, social, and historical events unfolding around them, particularly concerning Israel.
They saw God's hand in current events.
More than just saw his hand, they experienced the events themselves as God's actions. Their writings, the analysis argues, are powerful precisely because they convey this overwhelmingly vivid consciousness of God as actively present in their contemporary history.
So things that a secular historian could explain purely in terms of, say, military power or economics.
Like the rise of the Assyrian Empire threatening Israel, which Amos experienced, or the Babylonian army besieging Jerusalem, which Jeremiah experienced. These humanly explicable events were simultaneously experienced by the prophets as also being acts of God.
Experienced as embodying his judgment or his call.
Exactly. They weren't just geopolitical shifts. They were experienced as embodying God's righteous anger against Israel's social injustice or idolatry, but also, often simultaneously, as embodying God's offer of mercy and call to repentance.
And the analysis stresses this wasn't like a theory they came up with later.
That's a key point. It insists this prophetic interpretation was not primarily a philosophy of history or a theoretical pattern imposed retrospectively. It was, in the first place, the way in which the great prophets actually experienced and participated in these events at the time.
They lived it as divine action.
Yes. They weren't portrayed as coolly inferring God's abstract attributes like mercy or righteousness from the events. They were described as being immediately conscious of the eternal, the divine, acting towards them and towards their nation in these specific dynamic ways. They were, in the terminology of this analysis, experiencing as their contemporary history as the sphere of God's direct personal action.
Okay, how does this apply to the New Testament then? What's the key example there?
The analysis identifies the primary instance of faith, the rock on which Christianity is based, as the disciples' act of seeing Jesus as the Christ.
Their recognition of who Jesus was.
Yes, but understood not just as an intellectual conclusion, but as an experience. Think of Peter's famous confession, "You are the Christ." The analysis interprets the faith of the early disciples like this. Their experience of walking with, listening to, and interacting with the human Jesus of Nazareth was for them simultaneously an experience of being in the presence of God's personal purpose and claim and love.
So encountering Jesus was encountering God's action.
That's how their experience is presented. Whether they immediately use sophisticated titles like Messiah or Son of God in the fully developed later sense is debated, but the analysis argues those terms eventually emerged to articulate this foundational experiential recognition. The faith they came to express later was implicit within that initial direct experience of who Jesus was for them.
Again, the emphasis is on experience over theory.
Very much so. It stresses that this primary response to Jesus was not portrayed as them adopting a theory about Jesus based on, say, calculating probabilities or philosophical arguments, at least not initially. It was an experience out of which Christian language and theory later grew.
Seeing him as Lord was a fact of experience.
Yes. A fact of experience given in their personal dealings with him. The analysis argues that the special character of their way of seeing and responding to him, which was clearly different from how many others saw him as just a teacher, a prophet, maybe a troublemaker, that specific way of experiencing as Jesus, as Lord, as the Christ, that is precisely the distinctive essence of Christian faith.
And this way of experiencing Jesus has implications for how Christians then live, for ethics.
Yes. The analysis suggests that experiencing Jesus as Lord in his full historical reality, including his teachings and actions, meant that his followers began to share in some degree both his experiencing of life as the sphere of God's redemptive activity and his practical response to God's purposes in the world.
They started to see the world through his eyes, in a way.
In a way, yes. And this leads directly to the Christian ethic. The analysis views the ethic taught by Jesus not just as a set of rules, but as the practical corollary of the distinctively Christian vision of the world.
The natural outflow of seeing the world that way.
Exactly. Remember the link between experiencing as and dispositional response. If you experience the world in a way derived from Christ's own experience of it, as the place of God's loving, reclaiming activity, then you will tend to live in it in the manner which such a character in our environment renders appropriate.
So Jesus' moral teachings, love your neighbor, forgive enemies, care for the poor, are descriptions of how someone naturally behaves.
They are presented as a general description of how someone tends spontaneously to behave when they are consciously living in the presence of God as revealed and embodied by Jesus. The ethic flows from the experienced reality.
Okay, that covers prophets and the disciples' view of Jesus.
Yeah.
Does the analysis extend this experiencing as model to other core Christian concepts?
Yes, it uses this lens to shed light on several other key ideas, starting with the concept of revelation itself.
Revelation, God revealing himself. How does that fit?
Well, revelation and faith are often seen as correlative concepts in theology. God reveals, self-disclosure, and humans respond in faith, perception, reception. This view of faith as religious experiencing as fits very neatly, the analysis argues, with a particular understanding of revelation known as Heilsgeschichtliche, or salvation historical.
Salvation historical, meaning revelation happens through events in history.
Primarily, yes. God is understood as actively revealing himself not just through words or propositions, but through his actions within human history, culminating in the events of Jesus Christ's life, death, and resurrection.
Okay.
Now, the analysis emphasizes that within this salvation historical view, God is portrayed as self-revealingly active in the world he created. But, and this is crucial, his actions are not depicted as being overwhelmingly manifest and unmistakable to absolutely everyone.
They remain ambiguous in a way, like we discussed earlier.
Exactly. They retain that quality of ambiguity.
Yeah.
And this is presented not as a flaw, but as vital because it preserves human cognitive freedom in relation to God. God acts, but in such a way that allows people the freedom to see or fail to see the events in question as divine acts.
Like the prophets saw God's action where others didn't, or the disciples saw Jesus as Christ, while others saw something else entirely.
Precisely those examples. This ambiguity means that revelation, understood as effective communication from God, only becomes actual when it meets an answering human response of faith.
So revelation isn't just God acting, it's God acting and someone perceiving it as God acting.
In essence, yes, the communication loop requires the human response, and this necessity for a free, uncompelled response of faith, of experiencing as, is seen as preserving the freedom and responsibility of the finite creature in relation to the infinite creator. God doesn't force recognition.
Okay, that's revelation. What about the Bible itself? How does experiencing as illuminate the idea of biblical inspiration?
The analysis suggests this framework helps understand the unique character of the Bible. On the one hand, the Bible records this stream of revelatory events in history, culminating in Christ. But what makes it different from, say, a secular history of the same period?
It's written from a particular perspective.
Exactly. It's written throughout from the standpoint of faith. It describes history and events as it was experienced from within by the prophets and then by the apostles. It's history interpreted through the lens of religious experiencing as.
So the inspiration of the writers isn't about God dictating words necessarily.
Not in this view. Instead, the faith of the biblical writers, their very capacity and act of seeing and interpreting these events as revelatory, as moments of God acting and speaking that is identified as their inspiration.
Their inspired perspective, their way of experiencing it.
Yes. The Bible's uniqueness, therefore, isn't primarily attributed to some supernatural mode of writing that bypassed the writer's own minds and experiences, but rather to the unique significance of the events of which it is the original documentary expression, which became revelatory through the faith of the biblical writers.
And because it records that original faith experience, the Bible itself can then function.
It can then function to mediate that same revelation to later generations. It becomes itself revelatory in a secondary sense, acting as a testimony that calls for and potentially elicits that same response of faith, that same way of experiencing, as from readers and listeners today.
Interesting. Okay, what about miracles? That's often a tricky topic.
Yes, and the theory offers a specific perspective here too. It suggests that a miracle, understood in a religious sense, is essentially an event through which we become vividly and immediately conscious of God as acting towards us.
So the focus is on the experience of God's action.
Very much so. A merely startling or unusual event, even one that seems, from a scientific viewpoint, to suspend the ordinary laws of nature, isn't necessarily a religious miracle if it fails to evoke that intense awareness of being in God's presence or witnessing his direct action.
It has to be experienced as religiously significant.
That's the requirement in this definition. An event must be experienced as religiously significant to qualify as a miracle in this sense.
Which leads to that striking conclusion.
Yes, a miracle is any event that is experienced as a miracle. The subjective experiential component, the act of experiencing as that event as an act of God, is presented as an essential element in the miraculous.
It shifts the definition away from just the objective properties of the event, did it break natural law, towards the interpreted experience of the event.
Precisely. It foregrounds the role of faith or religious perception in constituting an event as a miracle for the person involved.
Okay, one more application. The sacraments. Things like communion or baptism. How does the theory apply there?
The analysis sees sacraments as another key area where experiencing as is central. In sacraments, you typically have some ordinary material object, bread, wine, water, being used within a specific ritual or liturgical context.
Ordinary things used in a special way.
Right. And within that context of worshiping faith, these ordinary objects are then experienced as being vehicles of God's grace or channels of divine presence.
They become points of focus.
Yes, they become a focus of specially intense consciousness of God's overshadowing presence and purpose. In this sense, the analysis suggests a sacrament has the same religious quality as a miracle. It evokes an intense awareness of God's presence in action.
But it's different because it's ritualized.
Exactly. It differs from a spontaneous miracle mainly in its context. It's liturgical. It's a deliberate ritual product rather than an unexpected event in the flow of ordinary life.
And apart from that context of faith?
The analysis stresses that apart from the sacramental context of worshiping faith, the bread is just bread, the wine is just wine, the water is just water. They are ordinary material things with no inherent magical properties.
So what happens is, in the experience,
What happens is that within that faith context, they are experienced as channels or mediators of divine grace. They invite a peculiarly direct moment of religious experiencing as. The analysis suggests that, in this way, the sacraments fulfill for later generations of believers a similar faith-eliciting and faith-nourishing function that the personal presence of Christ had for his first disciples. They become focal points for experiencing God's presence in action.
wow. Okay, that has been a really thorough journey through this specific analytical framework. We've really covered a lot of ground.
How?
We started with the potential inadequacy of defining faith just as believing propositions. Then we explored this idea of experiencing as, rooting it first in everyday perception and psychology.
With those ambiguous figures and puzzle pictures.
Right. Then we saw the argument that maybe all conscious experiencing has this interpretive experiencing as character, even seeing a fork.
Which was the crucial move to address the subjectivity charge.
Yes. And then we applied that whole framework, faith, as religious experiencing, as potentially operating at different levels of significance to try and understand the structure of religious experience itself, particularly in the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Looking at how it might illuminate the experiences of the prophets, the disciples' response to Jesus, and then core concepts like revelation, the nature of the Bible's inspiration, the meaning of miracles, and the function of sacraments.
It really presents a sophisticated epistemological account, doesn't it? Describing faith as this interpretative element within the reported experience of living in the presence of God.
It definitely reframes faith less about belief about an absent God, more about a mode of perceiving and interpreting a present reality, however non-physical that reality is conceived to be.
And we need to come back to this, because the analysis itself insists on it very strongly. At the end, it's absolutely vital to remember the stated limitation.
Crucial point.
This entire analysis, detailed and fascinating as it is not presented as an argument for the validity or the objective truth of religious faith.
Absolutely not. The analysis explicitly states, but whether that experience of living in God's presence is veridical or illusory is another question altogether.
Veridical or illusory? Real or just in the mind?
That question is deliberately left unanswered here. The goal wasn't to prove that God is real or that these religious experiences accurately correspond to some external supernatural reality.
The aim was descriptive, phenomenological, as we said at the start. To give an account of what faith is like from the inside, how it functions as a way of knowing or experiencing, using these concepts borrowed from the philosophy of perception.
Right. To provide a description, hopefully, that could be recognized as a plausible account of the phenomenon of faith by anyone, whether they personally believe that phenomenon points to something objectively real or see it as a purely subjective, though potentially profound, human state.
The question of whether the experience actually matches reality, whether it's true, requires, as they say, another argument entirely.
Yeah.
An argument this analysis deliberately doesn't attempt to provide.
It really just offers a framework for understanding how someone might claim to know God by faith, by describing a possible cognitive structure involved, without making claims about the objective truth of the content of that knowing. It's a map of the structure, not a proof of the destination.
So looking back, we've journeyed from that simple distinction, knowing about versus knowing by presence, to this really powerful idea that perhaps all our knowing, all our conscious experience, involves interpretation through concepts, this experiencing as.
Even seeing the most ordinary things.
Right. And we've seen how this framework can then be used to describe religious faith as a particular, maybe higher level of interpreting the world's significance, experiencing the world as the sphere of God's presence and activity.
And exploring how that perspective might offer fresh ways to think about prophecy, the disciples' unique relationship with Jesus, the nature of revelation and inspiration, miracles and sacraments.
It definitely shifts the focus, doesn't it? Away from just seeing faith as nodding along to a list of beliefs, towards understanding it as a whole way of perceiving, interpreting, and being disposed to respond to reality, shaped by a perceived divine presence.
It certainly gives you a different set of conceptual tools experiencing as levels of significance, dispositional response to think critically, not just about religious claims, but maybe about the nature of perception, interpretation, and knowledge more generally.
And that does leave us with a pretty profound thought to mull over, doesn't it? If this analysis is onto something, If all our conscious experiencing is a form of experiencing, as if we're always inevitably interpreting the world through our learned conceptual frameworks, even just to recognize a bird or a fork, what does that imply?
What does it imply about the concepts we use, perhaps unconsciously every day, to navigate our own lives?
Yeah. And how might the different conceptual toolkits people possess lead them to experience the very same events, the very same world, in such radically different ways? We see that happen all the time.
You certainly do.
And maybe, just maybe, could acknowledging this fundamental interpretive layer in all human experience, not just religious experience, help us understand our disagreements a bit better? Whether those disagreements are about history or politics or ethics, or indeed about the presence or absence of the divine in the world, how much is shaped by the way we've learned to experience has?
That's definitely something to ponder long after our deep dive concludes.
Indeed it is. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into what was certainly a complex, but I think a really fascinating idea. And thank you, especially to you, our listener, for providing the absolutely incredible source material that made this whole exploration possible today.
Yes, it was a genuinely insightful piece. Really opened up a lot to think about. Thank you.
Until next time.